Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think our numbers are stabilizing in the room joining us. So I'd like to welcome all of you joining us for this fifth event in the GOVTRAN final conference season, which is running through September and October. My name is Tim Rayner, and I'm a research fellow at the University of East Anglia, part of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. And it's my pleasure to chair today's Roundtable panel in the GovTran series, stepping in for Andy Jordan, who's not able to act as chair today, unfortunately, as originally advertised. This series of events marks the end of the first three-year term of the Jean Monnet network GovTran, which stands for Governing the EU's Climate and Energy Transition in Turbulent Times. GovTran is led by the Free University of Brussels in collaboration with Ghent University, University of East Anglia, and the University of Eastern Finland. And under GovTran, we've published journal special issues, policy briefs. We've organised a MOOC, a series of events, including this final conference series. So if you haven't done so already, we would invite you to explore these outputs on our webpage. The project has sought to examine EU climate and energy policy against the backdrop of broader geopolitical and societal trends, such as the rise of populism, declining political legitimacy and social cohesion that threaten to destabilize progress in addressing climate change. And we've done this with a view to bridging academic and policy discussions. We've already had an excellent keynote event with Diederik Samsom from the Commission, and a number of roundtables like this one, including one on Monday that dealt with the EU's new adaptation strategy, all available as recordings. And today we'll be examining an issue of continuing salience in climate policy, the importance of a cooperative relationship between the UK and the European Union. Despite the acrimony surrounding the UK's departure from the EU, climate policy remains a significant area where continuing common interests are acknowledged by both sides. As holders of the presidency for COP26 in Glasgow, the UK government needs to work with partners with similarly ambitious climate goals to build momentum towards a successful outcome. For both the UK and the EU, this requires a degree of climate leadership in terms of both domestic example setting and external diplomatic effort. So what are the dynamics at work between the two sides as they affect the ability to develop and implement ambitious mitigation policies in their own jurisdictions and also promote action internationally in the run-up to and beyond COP26? These are the questions on our agenda today. Before I introduce the speakers, a couple of housekeeping remarks. Firstly, this event is being recorded. Secondly, we would strongly encourage participants to post questions and comments using the Q&A function in Zoom rather than chat. They'll be more visible in Q&A. We'll aim to take up these questions in a question and answer session after about 45 minutes of discussion with the panel, where I put questions to the panel. Now on to the panel then. We have four very distinguished panelists to reflect on various aspects of the scene that I just outlined. And they are Anthony Froggatt, who is Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow in the Environment and Society Programme at Chatham House. And his most recent projects are concerned with understanding the energy and climate policy implications of Brexit and the technological and policy transformation of the power sector more generally. We have Peter Vyss, who retired in 2019 from the European Commission after a wide-ranging and distinguished career, where his roles included advisor in the Commission's in-house think tank, the European Political Strategy Centre, and Chief of Staff to Connie Hedegaard when she was European Commissioner for Climate Action. Nowadays, he is Senior Advisor at Ruud Pedersen Public Affairs Consultancy. Then next we have Sarah Williams, who joins the Green Alliance Westminster-based think tank in November 2019 as head of the Greener UK unit. This unit coordinates and drives forward Greener UK's work campaigning with partners across the environmental sector to influence Brexit-related negotiations and related law and policy. And finally, we unfortunately were not able to be joined by the speaker from the Commission, Sylvie Maudoui, but we've been joined, we're very pleased, by Lisa Fisher, who's a program leader at E3G, leading E3G's efforts to drive complex changes across regulation, infrastructure and finance needed for deep decarbonisation of the energy system, and working to build the diplomatic coalitions necessary to develop more resilient and sustainable global energy systems. So that is our panel, I'm pleased to say. The way we're going to run things is to keep things relatively informal, no slides, but we'll start with about 45 minutes of questions from me, directed to particular members of the panel, who Andy and I, in preparing this talk, would be likely to be well placed to respond. But I've told the panelists if they wish to pass that question on among themselves, then they are also free to do so. Then I hope we'll have chance for some of the questions from the question and answer session in Zoom to be put to the panel. Excuse me. So, and we'll aim to wrap up it with about 10 to 15 minutes to go with final comments or any observations that members of the panel might have at that stage. Excuse me. So I want to begin by reflecting for a few minutes with you, panel, on the relationship between the EU and the UK as it was before the fateful referendum of 2016, before we move our focus slightly forward. So perhaps I'll start with Peter, actually, if I may. The UK has been widely regarded as a progressive force on climate policy matters within the EU. How would you characterise its influence on EU policy over time, from your perspective, having been an insider? And I'll take the advantage to have a drink while you answer me. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thanks, Tim. Yes, I would say that the UK did and has always had a very high profile with regards to climate change policy development in the EU, and indeed in the international negotiations that the EU engages in, and where the UK was an obvious key player within the EU team. Since I started working on climate change in 1998, the UK was actually G7 presidency that year. I just remember them, you know, it was the UK presidency quite soon after I started as well. And I was so impressed with how much resources and how much leadership the UK provided the EU in terms of its negotiating stance vis-a-vis the international community as a whole. And that continued throughout the time I was working in the Commission. And indeed, the fact that they're now chairing a COP for the first time in memory, indeed, since the Climate Convention started. This is the first time that a conference of parties has been taking place in the UK. That is something I long wished for, and shows the readiness of the UK's contribution to be, you know, as they're going to do whatever it takes, I hope. Now, within the policy making, I think there's also the imprint of the UK. And if I can take as an example the development of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions trading system, the system started in 2005, but the UK had already got by then its own national emissions trading system. And indeed, other member states, Denmark had one, and several others were thinking of introducing them. And the Commission's reaction was, oh, well, we don't want to see the EU's internal market fragmented into 28 different types of emissions trading. The real benefits would come through there being a single European scheme, and that's what the Commission proposed in 2001. The UK was key in supporting that proposal. And when it started in 2005, the UK discontinued its own national scheme and folded it into the EU scheme, and has always been a key player in its subsequent evolution. So I would say in that market-based mechanism, the UK has got its fingerprints there, more than perhaps just fingerprints. And let us not forget, it is still a mechanism which, since its beginning in 2005, has reduced its emissions, or the sectors covered by the emissions trading system has reduced its emissions by over 40%. Now, there may be various reasons for that. I'm not saying it's all due to the emissions trading system, but the ETS is still a flagship instrument. And indeed, the latest package from the Commission is further developing the stringency of the ETS and indeed widening its scope by the inclusion of new sectors. So I think the UK's imprint is all over this. And I think that's how the UK always wanted it, of course, but their influence over the things as they go on from here will be much less. There's no doubt about that. Okay.
And Anthony, if I could turn to you from the perspective of the UK and the development of the policy framework in the UK, how important was the fact that the UK was an EU member in that? Some commentators suggest that being part of the EU was a kind of double lock on the commitments that the UK had made domestically. Is that how you would see it as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things that we recognise as problematic as we left the EU. I mean, if we take, for example, the UNFCCC, it's non-binding in many ways. I mean, legally, so the UK or members can, I mean, there's peer pressure, but it's not binding. But having an EU target in which we were part of meant that effectively our target to the UNFCCC became a legally binding matter. So, I mean, I think across a number of areas, in particular relating to international agreements, that is the case. And the UK, to some degree, has recognised that in terms of its proposed reform of the sort of Environment Agency, creating a more a institute that had more legal framing and legal bite. I mean, I think we're rolling back on that as well, but absolutely important double lock. If I could say just a couple of other points in terms of the interesting things around the sort of the EU and as Peter said, the fingerprint that exists. It's important to recognise the voting weights, and obviously as a larger country, the EU really did have a opportunity to have increased influence on climate policy. And it also, if you talk to other member states or talking to other member states, very much there was a sense that they knew the UK would take a position and they could then coalesce around it. So it meant that the Dutch or the Danish or whatever knew that there would be a champion that had a strong voice and a strong voting weight in which to support climate issues. So in that way, I'd absolutely agree. Two other points, if I may. One is, in terms of the ETS, it's interesting, and it may be something to discuss, but the extent to which the UK was absolutely front and centre in terms of the emissions trading scheme, in the same way it was to energy market liberalisation. It took its own domestic views and then it imprinted it upon the EU. Some countries may not have liked that, but I would probably argue, I would argue that in many ways, market liberalisation has been good for climate change in terms of breaking up monopolies, enabling new actors to come in, increasing transparency, etc. So I think that is another area in which there has been, the UK's involvement in the EU has been very powerful. But it's just, the EU isn't a virtue, all shining, all wonderful. It also, pushed back on certain things, some in relation to climate change, some of the renewable energy policy targets, it pushed back on the second time round. So it wasn't absolutely virtuous in this. There was some swings and roundabouts, but I do think the UK has been progressive. And then finally, to answer your question, I do think that is, and that was one of the things that the Committee on Climate Change noticed in their report soon after Brexit, or noted soon after Brexit, is the amount of legislation that is based on EU legislation. So domestic legislation has been enforced, but it is in order to meet EU targets. And so without that, we are having to consider more carefully the direction that we have gone and are going in terms of not just targets, but more importantly, the policies and measures that enable us to deliver those targets. And I think that is still a significant area in which the UK does fall short. It is good at setting targets, but less good at meeting them.
Okay. Yeah, and Sarah, if I could bring you in your perspective from GreenDeal UK, was climate change an issue on which UK and EU interests were essentially aligned as you saw it, or were there perhaps some tensions? I think it's been alluded to perhaps when it came to more of the wider environmental agenda, perhaps. How do you see the relationship of the past?
Well, yes, I mean, yeah, there's certainly tensions at points, but I think generally you could see that both were wanting to be ambitious on climate change, and actually you do actually see that imprint slightly in the final trade and cooperation agreement that was agreed between the two sides. I think as a sort of environmental sector community, we tended to be a bit more worried about the implications for nature, particularly on the UK side, because the UK had, as Anthony said, did have stringent targets, whereas particularly DEFRA's responsibilities, the Environment Department's responsibilities, a lot of that was definitely driven from EU directives, and particular the role of the Commission and the European Court of Justice had been very important in those sorts of areas. So particularly referring to things like air quality. So it was, I think, obviously we wanted as a cooperative relationship as possible on climate change. It was much easier to tackle the climate crises if we cooperated clearly. But I think our sort of really, really big concerns, and a lot of what the last sort of couple of years, more than that, has been replicating things, particularly sort of from a more nature angle. It's taken up a lot of work just sort of to try and make back what we were losing, rather than necessarily even going further and becoming more ambitious. So it's been an interesting time.
Okay, Lisa, with you're more of a specialist in energy policy. So would you see in the past the interests of the UK and the EU being broadly aligned when it came to energy policy dimensions of climate change?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Anthony has already alluded to some of the elements that actually the contribution that the UK has brought very much is one of innovation in European energy markets. And of course, the interdependence continues. So it'll be interesting how the new, how there's a new balance that can be found between sort of where the UK system is going. And we're certainly still actually seeing quite a lot of innovation in terms of energy market design in the UK. And as ECG, we're actually really quite keen to leverage quite a lot of that across the channel. But of course, also vice versa. So I think that's a key one to highlight. I mean, the interests weren't always aligned, but the UK as a driver of ambitious energy policy, shaped by climate, has been really important. As an innovator, I mean, also what we've seen just before Brexit, I can perhaps touch on a bit more later on, is the emergence of the cooperation on offshore wind, and the UK has been very, a key driver, diplomatic driver as well. The UK has always been very good at what I call intra-EU diplomacy. So really working with a subset of European countries towards a shared goal. And I think on offshore wind, that was particularly visible. That cooperation has now not stalled. I know there's some work going on in the background, but we've lost a few years and we've lost critical momentum. We've, I think, lost a lot of certainty in terms of, I just read yesterday, I mean, the UK has got 50 gigawatts of offshore wind projects in the pipeline, and I think Germany and Ireland also around 30, 35. But we don't have that framework, even though it's mentioned in the Trading Cooperation Agreement, we don't have actually that political framework for cooperation at the moment. And I don't think we're acknowledging the urgency in terms of the need for joint strategic planning and sort of thinking through some of the obstacles in terms of energy market design and so on. So to give those project developers really the certainty that they can go ahead, that they can plug in, that they can access both markets, and that we can then, and this brings me back to climate, achieve our shared goals to 2030 or 2032. Yeah, I'll stop here, but we can sort of dive into that more.
Right, we can come back to that as we roll forward somewhat in time and later on in our discussion. But Peter just flagged his hand up there.
Yeah, and I wanted to build on what Lisa was just saying. I was making a point at the beginning that the UK had brought positive things to the European climate policy sphere. I think there's another direction of travel in that in the renewable space. The EU made the UK get a grip on renewables much more than they would have perhaps otherwise done in the absence of legally binding targets for 2020. I was in the Energy Commissioner's cabinet and responsible for the Renewable Energy Directive when those targets for 2020 were set. The UK wasn't greatly enamored by the level of target it was set. And quite honestly, it looked an enormous stretch. But amazingly, the UK has exceeded all expectations on my part. And it's made of the renewable sector a big story about growth and jobs. And it's really trying and successfully, it seems, capturing the potential that was in the North Sea or in the coastal waters of the UK. I think it's an enormous success story for the UK today that I'm hopeful will be built upon in the future. But I think the seed or the catalyst of it was the setting of those targets in the negotiations that were taking place in 2008, and where the UK was accepted to have a renewable target that was legally binding, mainly because the Germans were absolutely determined to have it. And in exchange, of course, the UK got other things, and an ambitious climate target, for example, both of which I think we've now met, the 2020 targets. If we did meet them, I admit some of the targets, I think the energy efficiency one was met by virtue of the fact that the economy shut down for the unfortunate reasons of the COVID crisis. But I think it's remarkable that so much has been done in the renewable space in the UK. And I think the European Union has made a contribution to that effort.
Yeah. I'll just let Anthony come in briefly before we move on further into our kind of story with the result of the referendum and the negotiations that followed. But Anthony, yeah, please do.
Yeah, just a rumor or apocryphal story that I don't know if Peter could verify. At the time, it was said that Tony Blair signed up to it because he didn't understand the difference between energy and electricity. And that the 20% target, they said, oh, 20% electricity, easy. And only when they got home did it made clear to him. But absolutely agree with Peter. It was people were surprised the UK signed up to it. And they did take a big gulp and did put in place the measures. I do think it's what I mentioned earlier, they pushed back on the 2030 targets being legally binding, which is a real shame because it was just on the cusp of when they were demonstrating that the renewables weren't an expensive folly. They were actually delivering very, very cheap power. And so, yeah, it was a bit in terms of timing and the technology and the political understanding, it was a real shame because I think absolutely if the targets weren't binding for 2020, the UK would not be in the same position it is now in terms of its offshore wind.
Yeah. Okay. That's great for setting the scene of the relationship as it was before the referendum. But then we had the fateful referendum of 2016 and Article 50. We all found out what that meant and how it was triggered. And negotiations began. And just a couple of questions maybe on what the priorities were during the negotiations. Perhaps Sarah, you were watching negotiations closely. What were the UK's priorities in the negotiations, as far as you could tell, for climate and perhaps environment more widely as well?
I think just the one word, obviously, that summarises everything is sovereignty. That was the sort of utmost priority of the UK government, and I think perhaps we may now only finally be appreciating the consequences of prioritising sovereignty over, say, frictionless trade in the UK now. But that really did drive everything. So particularly in the negotiations for the trade and cooperation agreement. Because the UK was sort of so obsessed with just doing a sort of a standard deal, an off the shelf trade deal, like any normal trade deal. It basically did, unfortunately, sort of carve out climate change from the negotiations. It wanted to put into it a separate energy agreement, which meant that we sort of missed an opportunity to have sort of more cooperation upfront on climate. And yet, obviously, this energy agreement the UK wanted was a pretty good, but it sort of effectively ignored sort of the impact of climate change and the role of reducing emissions in transport, industry, agriculture, for example. So it was quite a strange and frustrating focus. And I think, as I said, if we'd started off with climate cooperation at the heart of the sort of the UK's negotiating mandate, we probably, hopefully, would have ended up with a lot better deal on that front. I mean, it's, as I said, the final deal shows that both sides want to be ambitious on climate change, but for us, the deal really did fall short on climate cooperation. And as I said, that was because I think the talks were made more complicated by the UK initially trying to sort of separate climate off from the sort of a bigger, more encompassing deal.
Mm-hmm. I would have asked our speaker from the Commission how the EU priorities were at that time and how they found contact with the UK set of priorities. I don't know if you, Peter, from your position, you have explained in the past that as a British subject within the Commission after the referendum result, you were not negotiations weren't as transparent to you as they might have been. But did you have a perspective on how the EU was putting climate into the negotiating terms?
Yeah. Well, indeed, the British nationals were kept at a safe distance away from the withdrawal negotiations. But clearly, the EU's worry was that the UK might withdraw and separate itself from the level of standards of environmental protection that the EU has introduced in the past. And the EU was trying to secure the level playing field, post-Brexit. And I think that was its major concern. However, it's a fact, as Sarah was saying, that the UK could have, in the withdrawal process, have made certain choices, such as to keep its emissions trading system linked with the EU system. But almost as a matter of principle, they wanted there to be a separation for reasons of sovereignty. And we're now in this sort of phony war type situation where we're looking at each other, wondering whether there'll be a recoupling of schemes in the future. But in the meantime, the UK insists it's considering linking with other jurisdictions elsewhere in the world. That, politically might be where they are today. But I still think the case for there being a relinking of its still very compatible emissions trading with the EU would make economic sense. Whether the politics would go well, I'm not sure. But all I would say is this: the higher we all are in terms of ambition on climate change, the more important it is for us to do things cost efficiently. And that's, if you like, one of the ways in which by having a linked emissions trading systems, we might be able to reduce costs overall. But again, those negotiations are not, I don't think, imminent. And we'll have to see when the time is right. But it's a shame, really, that separation was made of a system that was obviously compatible at the time of the referendum, but where a separation was made more for reasons of principle than for practical purposes. Yeah.
Okay, and then the deal was, to everyone's considerable relief, I remember in December 2020, finally arrived at the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So let's take a few minutes to consider its contents. And Sarah, from a UK perspective, how well do you think climate change is addressed in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement? And would you foresee any particular challenges in its implementation?
Well, there'll be a lot of challenges for sure, but perhaps not directly in relation to climate change. I mean, basically, climate change is an essential element of this agreement, and that's the first time that's ever happened. And so we were really, really excited by that. It was really great to see. And as I said, it really did show that both sides really do want to be ambitious on climate action. So I think it defines it as sort of saying, if you materially defeat the object of the Paris Agreement, then that would constitute sort of a serious failure of that essential element clause. So it's a really high, really high threshold to meet, but it's there, and that should be welcomed. And obviously, we think that should be included in new trade agreements across the board. And unfortunately, if you read the news about the UK-Australia trade agreement, it's going in anything other than that direction, which is a real shame. I mean, there are also some other bits they've got the sustainable development chapter where both sides sort of commit to working together on various things, including sort of the trade related issues and climate change. That's all great, but it's never really clear sort of how useful those particular chapters are. In trade agreements, they're not enforceable. I think the really interesting thing that we have to play with is that you have a non-regression sort of and rebalancing mechanism within the agreement, which obviously it relates to the level playing field, so both climate and environmental protections. And is an interesting part of the agreement is that it's slightly more binding than usual. There's an opportunity to sort of utilize tariffs or other things if there's a real dispute there, which is, as I said, normally environmental provisions in trade agreements don't really mean anything, but here we've got a slightly more bespoke system. But it's really early days. We're not sure how it's really going to work. It will require require some test cases even to define some of the terms, sort of lots of use of words like a serious sort of material divergence. So there's a lot of question marks still, but as I said, there were some really great things, I said, particularly on climate, but what it means going forward, this implementation, it's sort of all to play for really, I think, because as I said, it really will rely on some cases coming along, I guess, from either side. probably that I imagine that the EU might be bringing a few more cases initially than the UK, but it could happen either way, and that's important. All these things are reciprocal. Let's see how it goes, but yeah, we're keeping a very close eye. And I think what's also good is that we're finally starting to see some of the sort of specialised committees within the agreement starting to meet. So particularly the Trade Specialised Committee on Energy that had their first meeting ahead of the summer. Looked like from the minutes an interesting, perhaps slightly fractious at times event, reading between the lines, but at least these things are starting to sort of, start, frankly. We've been sort of in this weird time where we've sort of been just waiting for things to progress a bit. So the more these things can start working as they should, the better, really. So yeah, a bit watch this space, but we've got some things to be working with, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. And from an EU perspective, would the Commission have regarded climate elements of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement as useful and to their liking? I don't know. I don't want to pick on you too much, Peter, because we've seen the slight constraints that you were operating under, but how would it have been seen?
I was out. I think I was out of the Commission by the time the UK left, but actually I was still there when this agreement was reached, I think. Anyway, the climate people were happy with that. I mean, it was, as Sarah describes, it's strong language. It's ambitious on both sides. That was a happy convergence of views. And so we've got to make sure that both sides will actually have difficulty meeting those obligations. I think also the EU, so its 2050 goals are extremely ambitious. So, we need to work together with our neighbours and partners like the UK to all get there together. So good, it was welcomed, and I think it was seen as one of the stronger components of the agreement, as I understand.
Okay. And Anthony, I think the agreement mentions certain forms of cooperation that could be envisaged between the EU and the UK. Could you sort of elaborate on what it, in concrete terms, it talks about in terms of the basis of cooperation between the two parties?
I mean, I think on climate, there's recognition of the importance of the international cooperation. I mean, I think we're seeing that to some degree within the boundaries of COP26, obviously jointly organised by Italy and the UK. So that creates a real mechanism, or more than a mechanism, an opportunity to maintain and in fact enhance that cooperation. So I do think, there are very specific opportunities in that regard. I think within the committees that Sarah talked about, there will be other occasions in terms of within the future of the energy markets and how that will develop. The UK left some of the key energy markets in terms of the trading of electricity, which I think is absolutely crucial in terms of moving that to a more flexible system. I think within each of the different sectors, there are opportunities for enhanced cooperation that will either be led by or potentially benefiting climate cooperation. So, I think in general, within the framework of the international conventions and then the particular sector arrangements.
Mm. But there are also, and I think Sarah probably alluded to them, potential flashpoints as well. Do you see any as particularly significant, or?
I think the most obvious one that we're waiting for is the question probably about carbon border tax adjustments in terms of the extent to which the EU moves ahead with this. In theory, it shouldn't affect the trading with the UK if the UK doesn't have a carbon border tax adjustment, because we'll have probably a similar price for carbon. But it raises interesting questions potentially about things that the UK imports into the EU and then re-exports, that the UK imports and then potentially manufactures or just re-exports to the EU. What does that mean? So I do think that as a flashpoint, something coming up, the UK is less favourable to a carbon border tax adjustment than I think the EU is. So we'll have to see how that develops.
Mm-hmm. Anthony, I can't hear you. You're mute.
Yeah, I don't know how. Hope I wasn't muted for too long. Just before handing over to Sarah, who just raised her finger. Just one thing, just to add to what Peter was saying about the ETS, if that's all right. About it's a real shame that it seems such an obvious thing to remain linked or to remain part of it. It's important to remember that the Northern Ireland is part of the ETS. I mean, it is, in terms of the politics of this thing, it just strikes me as, it really was a political decision rather than something that made any environmental or economic sense. But anyway,
I think, Sarah, were you hoping to?
Yeah, it was actually it links really well now, because it was your mention of the word flashpoints, and I think a lot of us were hoping for quite sort of bit of a less antagonistic relationship between the UK and the EU sort of once the deal had been done, say, once we sort of finally had left, and sort of frankly really hoping to be able to move into a bit more of a cooperative space. And actually, if anything, we've gone in the opposite direction, because it's the flashpoints that have come up, particularly regarding the Northern Ireland Protocol, and which we've seen quite a lot of issues already, and will continue to be so over the next couple of months, when there's a sort of a few more autumn deadlines for things to change or not change. And I think that's just something that we have to just be aware of, that the wider politics, or the sort of the high politics, is unfortunately going to continue, I think, to get in the way here. You sort of saw that the UK had a sort of an agenda at the G7 that was taken over by issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the relationships sort of suffered because of that. And I think it's just it's unfortunately these all things come at the worst time, I'm sure, but yeah, it's not been very well timed. And I think flashpoints is a word that we're going to have to unfortunately keep an eye out for going forward.
And Lisa, did you want to chip in and unmute first?
Yeah. No, I just also wanted to build on the sort of assessment of the role of climate per se in the cooperation agreement. And I feel like we have sort of achieved a lot, but it's still sort of characterized by a defensive spirit in some ways, rather than one that's about the UK and the EU putting joint forces behind driving an agenda forward. And in some ways, we all know why we arrived there, and there's blame on both sides in a way, but in some ways it's really a missed opportunity, because with the Green Deal we have this clear strategic objective of climate as a sort of also a security issue. We have the same on the UK side, and the fact that hasn't resulted in a sort of more positive political cooperation on climate is a shame. I think, like Anthony also alluded to, it's not too late. With COP26, there's an opportunity to build that cooperation now, and to sort of perhaps start moving climate a little bit beyond all the politics of the Northern Ireland Protocol and so on and so forth, because it's such a massive challenge. And another thing I think that we talked a lot about during the processes, I mean, the UK has an extraordinary amount of climate and energy diplomats compared with the EU. I know the EU is ramping up, and also individual member states, but again, this kind of joint capacity in terms of shaping the global agenda, also in terms of sort of the strength of multilateralism, because climate has actually emerged as an issue where, in terms of relations with China, it's actually one of the few areas where cooperation is possible, including actually with Russia. And so it is a shame that forces aren't being put together, but I hope that bit by bit we can rebuild that, and we can find a more political forum. The EU has its high-level dialogues on energy and also on climate with other big entities, so there's no reason why they can't emerge with the UK in even sort of perhaps higher intensity and frequency than with others as a sort of critical partner. But that's sort of in terms of the spirit. I think it was a little bit more on the defensive side, and I hope we can sort of use the current momentum on climate to flip that and get into a bit more sort of proactive space on climate cooperation between the two.
Thanks, Lisa. You very conveniently moved our focus forward into possible future opportunities and ways for the UK and the EU to engage in a more productive relationship. It seems to be the cooperation on climate needs to somehow be insulated from the wider, more kind of conflictual dynamic that Brexit seems to have brought about between the UK and the EU. I noticed, thank you to those tuned in for posting questions. And so I wasn't going to take them for a few minutes, although some of them kind of are quite germane to this conversation that you just sort of started on, Lisa. I mean, in terms of the cooperation globally, and I know you're engaging diplomatically at many levels, Lisa. So there's a question from Faye Farstad, which is relationship with other powers, the US and Norway, for example. That how did the panelists foresee the relationship developing in relation to other states? Do you have a comment on that?
I could just make one comment perhaps on that. And I'm going to link it with the carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal that Anthony mentioned. Just looking at the two countries that Faye quotes, the US and Norway, of course, the treatment with regards to the carbon border adjustment mechanism is very different for those two countries. Norway would be exempted because it's part of the emissions trading system, and the US would not be. I would say the EU is going to have relationships, of course, continuing with both Norway and the US, but they will be distinct. Norway being part of its internal energy market, emissions trading system, and indeed a near supplier of fossil fuels that we at the moment need very much. So we're going to have, obviously, there's an EU-Norway dialogue this week, I think, on Friday. With the US, I think it's going to be more difficult because the CBAM would apply to US in principle, as it's drafted. And so basically, I can see that as being quite not appreciated by the US. They will be upset. And I do see there is a danger that the COP26 might just be polluted by this proposal. And for now, the UK is keeping a low profile on it and saying, well, it's not us, it's the EU. And I think that's probably the best thing for it to be doing right now, because the UK has to bring everyone together at the COP and agree things that can be agreed and not be unduly distracted by things that are outside its control. But I do see CBAM as having a potentially souring effect on the dynamics at the COP. So things will be complicated going forward. And I do think that the CBAM is a tricky proposal. It will take time. But I think the real problem with the UK, the impact of the CBAM on the UK is that UK might be entitled to full rebate of whatever adjustment there is, because the UK has an explicit carbon price, which is even higher than the UK price, but it's administrative stuff. It's the complication with the paperwork. And I think we're seeing in the trade flows between the UK and the EU at the moment that administrative requirements are still sand in the cogs of free-flowing trade, and can be more of a barrier than we'd like to have, or that we ideally like to have. So I wouldn't underestimate the potential of CBAM to impose those administrative burdens on the UK, despite the fact that the UK would be eligible for rebates. So I think CBAM is a really tricky one, but I mean, it is going to start slowly. It's not going to entail any payments until 2026 and beyond. And in the meantime, there's time for discussions with all our international partners to see how it goes forward. But I think at the end of the day, the CBAM will happen. And it's more a question of how and when that has to be thrashed out. But I think the intellectual merits of there being some sorts of protection against carbon leakage is something that's in the collective interest, actually, globally speaking. Yeah.
Okay. One or two of you have mentioned this tricky period that we're collectively, the UK and the EU, in at the moment with spike in energy prices and a need, I suppose, that both the EU and the UK have to maintain public support for ambitious decarbonisation in the face of this. I think, Lisa, you've written about this recently in terms of urgent steps that the EU and the UK should be taking. Is there a kind of cooperative aspect of that into the ways that this spike in energy prices can be handled so as to not derail kind of public buy-in for decarbonisation? How would you see that?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question to look at it through the lens of cooperation. I think there's two sort of levels of responses. There's, of course, a response right now to all those affected, be it by their own energy bills or their businesses and jobs, which I think I'd like to separate out a little bit from the medium-term response, which is about resilience against future crises, where I think there's perhaps a bigger element of cooperation in that, whereas the more immediate response is perhaps much more national or European Union level. But in terms of the medium-term response, I think of course there were so many factors for this crisis, but gas is at the heart of it, and the volatility of those prices. And I've been actually quite surprised that a lot of the reactions in the narrative in the media have recognized this and see that a reason in that for sort of accelerating the transition. But I also do think that there's quite a few things we haven't worked out. So if we do, turbocharge the transition, we deploy energy efficiency, of course, that's good for cutting energy bills, faster deployment of demand side response. I think there's a lot Europe can actually learn from the UK. More interconnection, of course, is part of that, and so on. But there is a lot we haven't cracked in terms of transitioning to high renewables systems. How do you share costs and benefits in that? How do you establish an energy security? And the UK National Grid has ambitious targets. There's quite a few transmission system operators in Europe that have 100% renewables targets to 2030, 2035. I think a dialogue and actually joint innovation around that and thinking through how that system could actually work in practice. How do business models look like? How do you do the tariffs? What about cybersecurity? All those issues, I think they're cooperating, given we are in the end in a shared energy market. I think there's definitely agenda for cooperation, alongside, of course, bringing down the costs of things like battery storage and so on. There, I suppose, then is another layer, which is about how global relationships change if we reduce our dependence on gas. Now there, I don't quite know whether there is so much overlap in terms of UK and EU interests and approach. I'd be interested in Peter and Anthony's and others' views on that. Yeah, there definitely is an agenda. I think there is a need for innovation on and collaboration on delivering high renewables, if not 100% renewable systems. And I could see how cooperation, that takes us almost into the science and innovation part, but not only, it's also a lot about the actual deployment and innovation around regulation could be very beneficial.
I think Anthony was indicating he wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just a bit to reflect and build on that. I was cycling in this morning, listening to the radio. We should do that. But they had a Treasury minister, I can't remember who it was, Simon somebody or other, basically denying that Brexit was anything to do with the oil tanker, the problem with access to oil. And you're sort of right, it's a combination of things. But to say it's nothing to do with Brexit is a bit bonkers. And I think it's the same with the high gas prices. It clearly is a combination of issues, but one of which you can't deny is Brexit, in terms of the moving away from integrated systems. The UK closing down its gas storage facility in Rough isn't a Brexit thing, but it was basically, it's part of a different strategy that the UK takes. It was a fire in the IFA electricity connection. It was, yeah, it's all part of this system, and we have a chaotic system within energy and climate, And it's chaotic in part because we need to transform it very quickly, and that speed of transition is going to be chaotic in some areas. We also have it chaotic because of climate change itself. So you can argue one of the reasons that we have high gas prices now is because, there's been unusually calm wind over Western Europe that meant more gas is being used. So I would sort of pull that back and say that it is this question of resilience, is that we know things are going to be chaotic going forward because we need to change fast, because we have climate change. And a way in which we have resilience is cooperation and joint infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So as we remove our ability to do balancing across the electricity interconnectors, we're tying one hand behind our back in order to be able to integrate more renewables. So I do think us taking the bigger picture in terms of how do we, post-Brexit, I suspect what would happen is things like the ETS, it will be an administration away until we really join, in terms of it just, the set of people that negotiated the leaving deal have to just retire and move on. Other people will come in that don't have the political baggage that will say, of course we should do this. And I think we'll see that the same with the interconnectors. I'll see the same with research and development. I think there's a whole other series of areas in which we will reintegrate in a softer way, but I think that's absolutely essential. And I do think in terms of climate change, that cooperation will, as Peter said, we need to be efficient economically and resource-wise in addressing climate change, and having cooperation across a number of areas with the EU it obviously makes sense.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think I've got an eye on the clock and I'd like to move to quick Q&A soon. But before I do, I think this event was billed as partly related to COP26. And I wonder if anyone would like to reflect on what difference it makes that the UK is the host of COP26, but it's doing it now under a Brexit-oriented government, and it's no longer part of the EU delegation. To what extent are the UK and the EU at COP26, working along the same agendas? Does it make much difference that the delegations are now separated, not the machine that they once were, with the UK active in climate diplomacy as part of the EU? Who wants to just?
If I can just try to offer, I don't have knowledge of what the preparations for the COP are in the UK or indeed within the EU delegation. But the first point I'd make is, in the past, it tended to be the presidency of the EU, the country who was occupying the rotating presidency, who spoke on the EU's behalf, with the Commission sitting next to them, and the Commission no doubt taking the floor as well. By the UK being outside the EU, there is now another vocal voice arguing for high ambition that can take the floor and reinforce the arguments for high ambition. So that's the discipline that the EU tries to enforce. It doesn't muzzle the member states. The member states can take the floor as well, but in the negotiations, in the side rooms of the conference, the contact groups, as the jargon is, you tend to have representatives from each of the regional groups. And of course, the EU would normally be there. And now we can have the UK, of course, will be the presidency anyway, so will also be there. So there's kind of synergies that might help a good outcome, but I think this is a tricky COP for other reasons. I mean, the COVID is the most obvious thing. Is it a COP that can make big decisions? I think it's one of those COPs where there's arm twisting before to make people's pledges stronger, and then as much mood music can be generated around the COP as possible to try and cement those. But I don't know exactly what the big takeaway will be from this COP. you know, there's very often things like an action plan or a Warsaw Declaration or whatever it is that, you know, there's some product that the UK will no doubt want there to be at the end of this COP, because other than the increasing pledges, which are largely made in advance of the COP, the Paris Agreement doesn't foresee, unless I'm mistaken, any major event happening at this COP, other than the sort of recognition or the noting down of those higher pledges, important though those are. They were on the cards already. So, well, you know, we'll have to see how successful a COP it is. It will be determined in part by how successful the pre-COP is starting today in Milan. And of course, the COP itself. We hope that there isn't a resurgence of virus in anywhere in the world really before then.
Anthony, I think you wanted to come in.
Just very briefly, the pre-COP's in Milan. It is a joint Italy-UK COP. So we mustn't forget that. And we mustn't forget that the G7 hosted by the UK, the G20 hosted by Italy, if the UK and the EU can't work together on this COP, it's a bit gloomy in terms of our future cooperation on climate change. So it really is interlinked. And I haven't, you hear occasional things that the EU or the UK is doing it wrong, but I do think that there is, a good relationship. And I hope that that turns out to be the case.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Lisa, please.
Yeah, if I may briefly. I mean, one thing, I don't know if Sarah, for example, you'd agree, but from a UK perspective, it is a blessing that the UK is doing the COP presidency this year. Post-Brexit, it helps us keep climate on the agenda. And like you were saying earlier, there was this tension between free trade agreements and the environmental agenda, for example. It helps from a purely domestic point of view to keep the topic on the agenda. So I think that's definitely a positive. And I also think that the UK COP team has been in a very difficult situation with, the global context, COVID response, strains to multilateralism. The US very welcome back in the game, but probably, also coming up with a lot of initiatives. And I think sort of stewarding this process hasn't been easy. I think you're right that it's important that the UK-EU collaboration works this time, but the UK also has a few very important of its own initiatives, especially around coal. And I think giving that prominence and making this the COP where, we are consigning basically coal to history, and this is a bit of a UK thing, I think is helpful, is important, would be a really big milestone. I think another thing where it would be really important that UK and EU join forces a bit more, and where the UK has made mistakes, which is around the solidarity agenda. And Peter, you mentioned the EU CBAM is also sort of a negative solidarity signal, but the UK cutting its aid budget didn't help in terms of the sort of setup around COP. I think there's chances to correct some of this through the climate finance agenda and really delivering on some of the goals around 100 billion and really ramping up capitalization of MDBs. And I think in the past, that cooperation around multilateral development banks between EU shareholders and UK shareholders has worked fairly well. And I hope that that'll continue to do so, and that they'll manage to sort of at least course correct some of the negative signals that have been sent in the context of COVID earlier this year. So just in terms of also Peter's question of what needs to be delivered, I think that's one of the key pieces alongside the coal piece.
All right, I did say that I would like to bring in some of the interesting questions that are appearing, and to other people listening in to this panel, do post others or vote for the questions that you find most interesting. And there is the one at the top, I don't know if you can see this as well, from Claire Dupont, quoting another significant actor in the whole Brexit saga, Michael Gove, who apparently, I don't remember this event, but mentioned the potential for the EU and UK to become rivals in climate governance or climate ambition that could lead, being rivals, could lead to higher and higher ambition in both jurisdictions, that they could engage in emulous rivalry. I'm not sure if that's his phrase. An interesting one. Do the panel see any evidence that is happening or could happen? Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely opportunity, isn't there, for, I like to say, a friendly rivalry. And actually, another interesting thing to reflect on is that there's an opportunity within the four nations of the United Kingdom as well to have a sort of race to the top on standards as well, if it could. And actually, there are some interesting. We have set up. We are setting up new institutions. So in England and hopefully in Northern Ireland, we've got the new Office for Environmental Protection, which is the new sort of body that's been established to enforce environmental and climate law. Obviously, as the environment sector, we'd like it to be more independent and have sort of better powers, and we'll continue to push for that whilst the bill establishing it is currently going through Parliament. But it is going to have a sort of a more direct relationship with public bodies, for example, on enforcing the law than the European Commission and the European Court of Justice could ever have had. So there's a potential opportunity there for a sort of slightly more bespoke system to perhaps have more of an impact. So we'll see how that one goes. As I said, there's still plenty to be fighting for, and we're hoping this bill finally gets through Parliament just ahead of COP26 and establishes a new framework that the UK government could be proud of going into the conference. But yeah, still a bit of work there to do in the next couple of weeks.
That's another point, isn't it? That this biodiversity agenda seems to have been linked into climate by the UK, and I think possibly the EU as well. So thanks for commenting on that wider environmental aspect of things. Who else wants to comment on Claire's interesting question about the emulous rivalry, whether there's any sign or could be any sign? I think I saw Anthony's.
Yeah, can I ask a question of my panelists on this? Because I generally don't know the answer. Maybe Sarah or Lisa might. I always find it odd the UK, before the Biden summit in April, put forward a 2035 target. And I never quite understood why that was. Was that because the EU was formally announcing its 55 at the summit and the UK had already announced its NDC and it still wanted to announce something? Or did it have to do this? I just wondered if this is an example of the UK trying to be out-competing the EU. And I don't know if it was a legislative thing or not.
Sarah's shaking her head as though she doesn't know. I'm not sure anyone knows. But would anyone else like to comment on the general? Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of emulous rivalry. I don't think it's in play with regards to the making of pledges, because now we're both committed to climate neutrality in 2050. But where I would like to see there be competition is on competing who keeps its promises along the way. I mean, now having made those pledges, let's do the more difficult task of actually getting on the pathway to meet those promises. And in that respect, I would just recall that marshalling 27 nation states, as the EU does, is a tough one. And we're very diverse. Not all of the states are as engaged in phasing out coal than others. You know, we've got, it's a hard task for the EU. So in a way, this is a race the UK ought to win. But whether it can or not, of course, depends on whether they can get all those gas boilers replaced in houses in time, and so on and so forth. The EU has to do all of that too. So we're really facing a mountain of ambition, which is doable. Indeed, arguably, we must succeed, but it's going to be tough. And I think we should be competing in terms of the interim targets, the 2030, but yes, why not 2035? The EU targets can always be broken down, and we can almost give an annual update of whether we're on track or not. Indeed, the European Environment Agency does such monitoring very much looking at what progress has been made in the last 12 months, and that sort of closeness of monitoring is something that's done in Europe. I'm sure it'll be done in the UK, but let's compete on that. That's a worthy ground for competition, I would say.
And perhaps, Tim, can I just add very briefly? I think some of the rivalry that we might see could be more around technology and also standard setting. So I'm thinking about standard setting in terms of sustainable finance taxonomies, where that's raised to the top on which one will prevail, and hopefully the most stringent one, and not the lowest quality one. But I think that's a very, very important one to bear in mind. Or technology. I'm thinking about hydrogen, where at the moment the European Union and the UK have very different approaches and priorities, but hopefully they can actually compete in terms of bringing technology costs down, but also making sure, you know, the standards are high, even if it's, you know, fossil produced hydrogen or whatsoever, that actually the sort of abatement standards are really high. So I think we might see that kind of race to the top in more specific areas of economic and technology leadership or standards.
Okay.
Could I even suggest, just while we're on that point, that CCS, carbon capture and storage, might be one of those races that we engage in? I mean, I think the UK's got a head lead, just, you know, short lead over the EU. The EU needs to do more on that space, but there are projects being developed here. It's one of the examples of technology where we might helpfully compete with each other and even collaborate, dare I say it, you know.
All right. You mentioned rather handily a minute ago, Peter, the European Environment Agency. So I'm going to go back to the Q&A, because there is actually a specific question about the agency. In the
Claire again. Ledipol has helpfully asked.
Questions from Claire, yeah. The UK obviously no longer a member, but you don't have to be an EU member to be part of the agency. So is there a potential for the UK coming back to kind of build those bridges that fell into whatever with the UK departure from the EEA? What might be the prospects there?
I don't know the statutes of the EEA in terms of who can apply for membership, but there are indeed more states that are members than there are member states of the EU. Why not? I mean, there can always be, if not, then the UK will presumably, its own environment agency can closely collaborate. But there would seem to me to be synergies, especially when we're talking about such a close neighbor that should, as has already been mentioned, be enhancing, we should all be enhancing resilience, and networks are key to resilience as well. Energy networks, whether they be electricity grids or gas pipelines and such like. So why not? I mean, I don't know why they left, actually. If they didn't have to leave, it must have been pure optics.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sarah has a wry smile on her face as you're talking about this, so I think she wants to come in here.
Yes, I think having European in the name was unfortunate, really. I think it really stymied some quite obvious moves. I mean, yeah, we'd love the UK to rejoin the European Environment Agency. I mean, Andy was often talked to me about how useful his I think he was a board member for a long time. We really saw the value, helpful for monitoring, but just, yeah, as you say, sharing of scientific expertise, like it's a good thing. And we were lucky enough to host sort of the State of Environment report just before the UK left in London. I constantly ask DEFRA about this, the Environment Department in the UK. They say no decision has been taken yet so it's not off the table, but there's not a big push. So yeah, we've got a little mini campaign, I think, which we're always looking for people to sign up to. I mean, the UK is still having to fulfill certain requirements because of commitments set out in the withdrawal agreement. So there is still a bit of a relationship there that we can build on as well. But no, I think we should all be pushing it because it's an obviously good thing, I think, for us to rejoin.
Anthony, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just one or 2 points. One is, I do think it's a generational thing. I think as we get rid of certain politicians, these things will become open, and it is across the board. I mean, within the energy sector, we're no longer part of the European network of gas transmission operators. When we could have been, we didn't have to leave it, but we have. And these are serious. I'm sorry, the electricity one we left, gas one we had to leave. So yeah, there's lots of intra-European bodies that we've left when we don't need to, and I think we'll go back. I mean, just one example probably is the research and development. We have rejoined the framework programs by buying into it. And that was something that the government said that they wouldn't do, that we would have our own framework research programs, and then we could choose to do research with whoever we like. But in actual fact, there has been sufficient pressure in order for us to rejoin or to not leave. And I think that's an optimistic sign.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just trying to get around to a couple more of the questions. The first question that was asked very early, I don't know, I have a feeling that one of us may be able to comment. From Anthony Joseph Brogan, the importance of rail expansion to decarbonisation. How can the UK cooperate to facilitate both increased passenger and rail freight? Oh, it's the EU's flagship EU Year of Rail. Forgive me, but I didn't know that. But is rail a potential area of cooperation? Is anyone able to comment on that?
I don't really know. I am myself. But of course, all the modes of transport, of course, we climate advocates love rail, generally speaking. But I mean, because of the fact it's already a low emitting means of transport, certainly we're electrified. It's perhaps the focus of least push, unlike cars, unlike aviation and maritime. Rail is considered to be a cleaner mode of transport that everyone would like to see more of in Europe. But I really think by leaving the EU, the UK has unfortunately sort of cut itself off from the concepts of trans-European networks and the funds that facilitate the building of those. So I'm sure it's all possible with the right will.
I was quite excited to see the German Green proposal, a graphic of it for the reopening overnight trains and the very expansive network that was envisaged, including the UK. I was pleased to see.
Yes, I always saw that as well, liked it too.
Perhaps I can, is this also just a partial answer to a great question? Digging deep in my Department for Transport history. I mean, I think there's several levels. I think also on rail, there's this sort of defend and protect level where it's about interoperability of systems, which is really important just to keep, I mean, this is mainly the Eurostar, but to keep that going. So that's the first thing. And I don't actually know how that's been affected by Brexit specifically, or how cooperation on that's been affected. But I think that's level number one. Level number two is, I mean, most of Europe is just entering what the UK has done 20 years ago, which is liberalization of the rail market. I think the UK has many good and bad lessons to offer. And I think given the strong shift we need onto rail of passengers, what we want to avoid is more sort of failures and shambles and so on. And I think sharing those lessons would definitely be beneficial from a European point of view, and making sure this process runs smoothly on the European side and doesn't hamper trust in rail and in that shift. And the third one is a bit of a sort of wildcard, but I mean, there's also rail in terms of rail networks as a consumer of materials like steel. I don't know the extent to which cooperation is important in that sense, but building up that supply chain of low carbon steel is probably certainly something that both Europe, the European Union, and the UK would want to do. To what extent cooperation is in the interest of each, it would certainly be in the interest of climate. I don't know if it aligns with the national interests, but it could be interesting to think about a shared market here and shared supply chains.
Okay. Okay, we're approaching the end of our time, so I just wanted to give you panelists a chance to reflect on the discussion we've had and add any points to the mix that you thought might come up but didn't, in terms of the important relationship between UK and EU in cooperating on joint climate policy goals. Anthony, please lead off.
I'll kick us off. Maybe because I wouldn't mind answering the last question that's popped up about AUKUS.
Yes, I could. Yes, I was going to say yes.
Well, just because I think it raises a couple of points that were mentioned. I mean, in terms of the hope that the EU-UK relationship, despite the ups and downs, climate change remains on track. And I guess we all wish that across all sectors. I mean, and that's why China is such a good example, isn't it? Is that there may be dips in the relationship with China, but we hope climate change is unaffected by that. And I think that is an over-optimistic belief. I think, unfortunately, climate change, however important we may think it, and that it should be above certain politics, isn't. And I think that this is whether or not, China is not going to send a delegation to COP because of the AUKUS stuff, or because someone's talking to someone about it. Actually, UK doesn't recognise the Chinese vaccine. I mean, there's a whole series of different reasons why there may be problems, but we do know that China is absolutely essential. So I guess it's I would leave with a thought that climate change cooperation is essential. We know that, and that as much as we can divorce it from some of the other politics, the better. And I guess that's about highlighting the mutual benefits that come about through cooperation. And I guess that's the things that we've been talking about, is those, despite Brexit, the areas that we would like and think that cooperation and collaboration can and should continue.
Who'd like to follow? Sarah.
I kind of sort of lead from that, and actually also sort of reflecting on Lisa's earlier comments about how that we're still in a very defensive space, and basically that climate action could hopefully really push us into a much more proactive one. And I was just thinking about how it's sort of incumbent on all of us to work within our own networks as cooperatively as we can. So obviously environmental NGOs, but sort of academic circles, think tank circles. And I guess if we're doing it, we could then try and put pressures on our governments to do similar. But otherwise it can feel slightly, well, as I said earlier, it can feel quite frustrating otherwise. So I think I'm going to take that away from it.
Okay. Any closing reflections from Lisa?
Perhaps just the one thing, Anthony, when you said a next generation of politicians might change attitudes, my immediate reaction was, yes, but we don't have the time. So perhaps it was just that piece of urgency that I think is also really, of course, we have to recognize the broader politics, and a lot of this is not, in our hands, but I think articulating the piece of urgency, and in my case, I'm particularly motivated by what's happening in the North Seas, and make sure we actually get the renewables deployed that we need so critically for our climate targets, and Brexit not standing in the way of that. But there might, there are other issues. I think highlighting that and telling that story and just repeating it over and over again is, I think, something we need to do over the next year or two, to make sure it doesn't slip off the radar.
So I'm going to say, in terms of generation, I'm in the next cycle. So if we get rid of, when we have the next election and we get a different government, I say that's the next generation. I don't think 30 years from now. But yeah.
That actually speaks to the most recent of our questions that has popped up in the question and answer, which speculates about a change of government in the UK, although sitting in the UK at the moment, I don't see that as an immediate prospect personally, but thanks for also addressing that one. Peter.
Well, thanks, Tim. I mean, if I can say something to try and conclude that the 2050 goal, both for the UK and for the EU, is to be net zero in 2050. I don't think either jurisdiction expects its emissions to have become absolute zero. There will be, I think, and everyone understands this in these terms, that there will be legacy emissions in 2050, but that they will have to be matched, not by offset credits as they exist today that measure reductions on hypothetical baselines. We will need to offset those legacy emissions with CO2 removals, whether they be through technology or through direct air capture, being the most purest example, if you like, or through nature-based solutions. But what I would say is that the EU is just beginning to start thinking it's the regulatory framework for the certification of CO2 removals. And given their importance when we get to 2050, it's important that we do that well, that they're removals that can't be reversed, or rather that there are safeguards in the case of reversal. Now, I think the UK will be having to look at the same sort of thing, because also, despite all the work and the noise being made around voluntary carbon markets at the moment, many of those carbon markets are not governed as robustly as we would like. And I think there is a case for collaboration in trying to have good governance over the certification regime that Europe will be developing, which essentially will be producing, I think, domestic European removals to match European emissions. What the UK will do, I don't know exactly, but I just think that there's a space there where it's fertile ground. It's basically a white piece of paper that we've got to build from. And it would be great to collaborate in that sort of area, because the UK is clearly keen to do something in the case, in the space of voluntary carbon markets, particularly, but I'm sure greenhouse gas removal as well, and so is the Europeans. So I think there's a conversation to be had and developed there, so as to ensure robust governance, true accounting, and all those things that we've proven are necessary for market mechanisms to work, as we've been learning on the emissions trading system. But by then, there won't be any, by 2050, there won't be any more issuance of allowances under the emissions trading system. Whatever emissions there are will have to be matched by those removal certificates for the net zero to be achieved. So I think there's a lot of work there for the next generation of policymakers or researchers or whoever to put in place so that we can get there cost efficiency and cost effectively and environmentally in an integral way. Yeah.
All right. It does look as though time has caught up with us, I'm afraid. So I won't attempt to summarize that very rich discussion, but I would like to thank everyone for their active engagement and their excellent questions in the Q&A. And above all, to thank our 4 panelists for joining us today to share their valuable time and insights with us on this enduring, important question of EU and UK relationship as it relates to climate policy. The series of GOVTRAN events continues, so please join us next week if you can, on October the 4th in the morning. We'll find that on the GOVTRAN webpage and tweeted regularly, I'm sure. And the next event, the next panel, will be looking at the significance of the EU climate law. So thanks again for joining, and goodbye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.